All right, hello, hello, hello. Welcome to yesterlore. I am Grimm's lawyer, and we are here today to finish the awntyrs of Arthure at the terne wathelyne. We have been reading this for a few weeks now. So we're going to start today with a recap of what has happened thus far, and then we're going to try to finish the rest of the poem. I expect to finish before the end of the hour, and I hope that I will have time actually to talk about some changes to my sort of tentative schedule that I put forward before. I didn't really put forward a schedule so much as like a plan of things that we are going to hopefully read in yesterlore. But that will come at the end of today. We're going to try to finish the awntyrs of Arthure first. So, to return us to where we last left, we're not going to start with where we last left off. We'll end with where we last left off, and then we'll start reading. So, whoops. There's something on my screen, and fixing it is requiring me to move the text around. Okay, there we go. So, we started off, we are in we're in Cumbria, in the area around Carlisle. We're sort of southeast of Carlisle, near we're in sort of like the area that's called the Inglewood, and there are quite a few Arthurian stories that are set in the Inglewood. It seems to be a mystical place. But Arthur and his host goes there to hunt. So they're going out to hunt, and while everyone else is hunting with Arthur, Sir Gawain and Queen Gainur, who is usually called Guinevere nowadays, but in this poem she's called Gainur, it's a pretty common name for her, they are hanging out under a tree, and then it gets dark, like it did in Three Dead Kings, and a ghost comes, and it's the ghost of Guinevere's mother, who's warning her, much like the Three Dead Kings did to the Three Living Kings, to, you know, be charitable, be kind, not be greedy, be a good queen, basically, and she's stressed to not be adulterous. And she also said, or we learned from Gainur asking her how to, like, save her from this sort of, like, purgatory of being a ghost. And we learned that it needs to be a bunch of trentals, a bunch of masses, groups of 30 masses that need to be done. So that's what we read the first week of this poem. We got almost to the end of that. Second week, last week, we finished sort of that episode of the story, and then they return to Carlisle, and they're having their feast, all, you know, celebrating all the great stuff that they hunted. And this knight shows up with his lady, and he is Sir Galeron of Galloway, Galloway being sort of in southwestern Scotland, so it's just to the north, and part of it is to the west, northwest of this region of what is now England. Galloway is sort of in what is now Scotland. And this guy comes and says, "Hey, Arthur, you have wrongfully taken my land and given it to Sir Gawain. And I'm not okay with that. I'm going to fight someone to regain that." And so, of course, Arthur is hospitable to him. He houses him, he gives him fancy room to stay in, they feed him. And Sir Gawain is kind of being his host in this scenario. We find out that not only is he all decked out and armed, his horse is all decked out and armed as well. So, anyways, they have their nightly stay, and in the meantime, Arthur calls a meeting, like asking his knights, you know, what should we do? What's our game plan here? Because this looks bad for us. And Sir Gawain says, no worries, I'll do it. I volunteer to be the knight to fight him, which kind of makes sense given whose claim he's contesting a bit. I mean, he's contesting Arthur because Arthur's the king, but it's Sir Gawain who's been given the land. So it's going to be Sir Gawain and Sir Galeron going at it. And where we last left off, Sir Gawain was not doing so hot. Sir Galeron had pierced him in the collarbone, the canelbone also, and cleft his shell de chain, cleaved his bright shield, and stabbed his collarbone. And we learned that that would like sort of be a lifelong wound that would give him grief moving forward. So where we're at, we're in the middle of a fight, and Gawain's not doing so great. So we're going to continue on. One thing I will say is, as the fight continues, we get some more sort of vivid description of the violence. Most of it is just, you know, them stabbing with swords, and we just get where they're stabbing. There's a bit of description of some bloody weapons, even in this first stanza that we're going to read. I'm just not going to spend a lot of time on that. I'm going to kind of gloss over that. But just be aware of that. Also, there is a... we learned last time the importance of these steeds that they're on when they're jousting. There is going to be a pretty grisly animal death in this episode, so I'm just letting you know, if that's a topic you don't want to be hearing about, then this might not be the episode for you to spend most time, and you might want to come back later, because an animal does die in this, but it is also very heartfelt. So again, if this is something that is sensitive for you for whatever reason, definitely just be aware of that. I'm just letting you know before we begin. But I will try to gloss over as much of the sort of gory stuff as possible, even for my own sake, but just in general. Not necessarily what we're here to do. We're here to find out what happens. So, Sir Gawain is on the ground. Oh, if you're wondering why I keep switching back and forth between pronunciation of Sir Gawain / Gawain, it's because the name pronunciation is different in different stories, and I struggle to remember to keep it consistent. I am used to calling him Sir Gawain. He's Sir Gawain in most of sort of the French-based stories, and this is influenced by some French stories, I think, this one. But when we're using alliteration, I try to stress it on Gawain, because it's usually the first stress syllable that you're alliterating on. And so that tells me that it should be Gawain and not Gawain. And sometimes we see it's, instead of Gawain, it's Wawan, or Wawain. We'll see that a lot more in other poems. One moment. Sorry. Sometimes the dog barks when neighbors come in, and there's lots of noise. It freaks him out a little bit. So there's been some people moving, and so that's been making him a little upset. All right. So where we left off, I was explaining the pronunciation of the name. So in this poem, because it's an alliterative poem, I try to remember to pronounce it Gawain, but there are so many more stories where it's pronounced Gawain. And Gawain is how most people pronounce his name just in general nowadays. When people talk about the Knights of the Round Table, they usually use Sir Gawain. To the point where in some adaptations, like BBC Merlin, they just completely erase the first syllable and it's just G-W-A-I-N-E is how they spell his name in that adaptation. So yeah, it's just really common to pronounce it Gawain or just Gawain nowadays. So it's hard for me to remember that it's Gawain here, but I'm trying my best. So if I'm flip-flopping, that is why. When I'm reading the Middle English, it's a little bit easier because I'm like in the rhythm of it, but when I'm explaining things, I might slip up again. You might notice I do the same with Gainur and Guinevere. It's Gainur, but sometimes I just slip and say Guinevere when I'm talking about her because it's the same person. All right, so let's continue. I think I should probably zoom in some more, I'm realizing. just to make it a little bit easier to, let's see, where were we? Yes, so I'm going to start reading, finally, 12 minutes after the beginning of today. Maybe we will, I still think we will finish this poem today. All right. Gawain and Galaron Gordon Herstedes, all in letterand gold Guy was hergere. The Lordes believe hom to list ledis, with man sergeant of massa, as was the manera. Burnes brochet the blancas, Burnes broched the blancas, with the sea the bledes. Either freke upon folde his fastned his herbe. His spera, I don't know, I said herb. Shaftes in she the woda face shindre in shedes. So jolly lay, this gentle juster on wera. Shaftes de shindre in shelde so shena. An sitten with brondes bricht. Reche miles de richt. Theren contrast de knecht with Gawain on grena. Okay. So this is just a description of, where we left off. Wait, I feel like I've read this already. Did the numbers get misaligned? I think they did. We left off here. I was like, this sounds familiar. Oh yeah. I think when I zoomed out, no. Okay. It seemed like when I zoomed out, the numbers changed. They are changing. The numbers are changing when I zoom out. Okay. That's strange. That seems like a bug that needs to be fixed. Yeah, I was like, we were on 520, but then when I zoomed in, 520 was way up here, and where we left off was way down here. Oh, I see why, because it's pushing things down. I see why. Okay. I think this level of zoom is where we were, and that's why it was 520. But I zoomed in more. Okay, maybe we have to stay at this level of zoom. I hope it's still legible to people. Okay, let's move on. So, this is what we're supposed to read. Because I was like, Gawain's not on a steed anymore, he's already on the ground. Okay. He clef thorch the cantel that covered the knecht. Thorch the shinan shell the shaft mon on mara. And then the laterle lord, lower upon hicht, and Gawain greches therewith and gremet full Sara. I shall reward the thee rota if I con red richt. He followed in on the freke with a fresh fire, thorch blason on brenne that burnish were bricht, with a borlich bronde thorch him he bar. The bronde was bloody that burnish was bricht, then gloppen that guy, hit was no fairly in fi, the storned strikes on stry, in stirrupes stricht. So, Gawain, it's just more description of their fight. Gawain retorts and is like, I'm going to reward you for what you just did to me. He was just stabbed, remember, in the collarbone, and he's like, I'm going to pay you for this, and then he strikes back at Galaran. Alright. Straighten his stirrups, stoutly his strikes, and whines at Sir Gawain, als he were woda. Then his lemon, on load skirless and shriekes, when that burly borne blanket on bloode, lordes and ladies, of that like a leakes, and thunked God of his grace for Gawain the God. With a swap of a sword, that sweetly him sweekes, he strode on of that steady head, straight for his stode. The fire full thundered and fell, bethrode. Gawain glopened in hurt, he was sweetly smert, out of stirrups his stert fro grisel the god. Okay, so, what just happened? Galaran keeps fighting him. They continue, so Gawain was just like, I'm gonna get back at you. Galaran's like, okay, so let's keep fighting, and they do keep fighting, and then we get we get a zoom back, and we hear that the lords and ladies enjoy this fight. It's entertaining for them, I suppose. And they thanked God for his grace for Gawain the Good. They're thankful that they have Sir Gawain to fight on the side of Arthur against this knight who's challenging him. But Galeron then does something horrible and, frankly, dishonorable. He cuts off the head of Gawain's horse, whom Gawain is no longer even on at this point. It's just evil and petty at this point, in my opinion. Why would you do that? The horse isn't doing anything. So, Gawain glopened in heart. He was just like boiling with anger. For Grisel the Good. Grisel is the name of his horse. So, we get a reaction here. Grisel, called Gawain, gones god water. He was the burlockest blanca that ever bought a bread. Be him that in Bethlehem was born ever to ben or bote. I shall venge to die, if I con richt rede. Go fetch me freson, firest on fote. He my stunde the in store, in as mekle stede. No more for the firefall than for a risrote, but for dole of the dombe best that thus should be dead. I mourn for no montur, for I might get mare. Als his stode be his stede, that was so goldet nede, ne'er Gawain wax wede. So wepte his Sarah. Okay, so Gawain is heartbroken at this loss that he just experienced. He says, Grisel is gone. He was the burlockest blanc. He was like the strongest horse that was ever bred, that ever bought bread, that ever ate. Basically, it's the strongest horse that ever ate. By him that in Bethlehem was born. So by God, by Jesus, should there ever be a remedy, I shall venge thee today. So he's gonna get revenge for the loss of his horse that he loved. And Galeron says, go fetch me my Frisian horse, my Freson, fairest in foot. And Gawain says, I don't give a rat's about any foal you're gonna bring. He can't bring himself to even think about horses right now. He's like, I don't care. I just lost my best friend. And as he stood by his steed that was good at need, Gawain nearly went mad. He wept so sorrowfully. He is very upset, understandably. Thus wepes for woe the wicht, and wennes him to quoite, that wondered is Sarah, that other droch him onrecht for dread of the knecht, and boldly blotched his blank on the bed bare. Thus might o drive forth the die to the derk nicht. The sun was passed be that me die and mare, within the listes, the lede lord that dawn licht. Toward the borne with his bronde he busket him jare, to bataille the bow with bronde so breed, shene sheldes were shred, bricht brenels bibled. Money dochti were a dread, so fiercely they feet. Okay, so the fight just intensifies here. He's like, I'm gonna drive the day to the dark night. He's gonna keep fighting. He's fighting even harder now that he's lost his horse. And then a lot of the warriors that are sort of there watching, they go from being like, oh, this is a fun, entertaining fight, to now they're like afraid about how intense the fight has become. Thus they fecht on fold on that firefelde, as fresh as a leon that falters the fill. Wille lay, thes wicht, men their weapones they welde. Witte je welle, Sir Gawain wantes no will. He broached him with his brand under the broad shield. Thor the wast of the body wounded him ill. The sword stand for no stuff. It was so well staled, that others started on back and strondest on stille. Though he were stunned that stonda, his strikes full sara, her gurdes to Sir Gawain, Thor ventile and pesain. He wanted noch to be slain, the bread of Avanhara. Hardily then, this hadeles on helmes they hewe, they betten dona bereles on borders brecht, schildes on schildres, that shene were to shewe, fretted were in fine gold, they filen in feet, stones of Iral, they strenkel and strewe, stide stapeles of stelle, they strike dona stricht. Born is bannen the tima, the bargan was brewe, the doty with dintes o delfeli were dicht, the dintes of the doty were dotes bedena. Both Sir Leta and Sir Laka, mitche mornen they make, Gainur great for her sake, with her grey aen. Okay, so I kind of just read two in a row because it's just describing more of how intensely they fought. We get some more imagery, there's some gruesome, and then there's just some more like these warriors in helms with their bright gold armor. It didn't avail because they're striking through it, they're cutting through each other's armor. People in the audience are just aghast at this point. They're just like going, they're distraught at how horrifyingly awful this fight is. Sir Let and Sir Lak, much mourning they make, and Gainur, great, she wept, she lamented for her sake with her grey eyes. Thus great is Gainur with both her grey yena, for grief of Sir Gawain grisly was wound. The knight of courage was cruel and keen, and with a stale broad that storn of stone, all the cost of the knight he carved down clean. Thor, the riche miles that ronke were on ronda, with a teneful touch he tacht him and tena, he gorded Sir Garelon, groveling on gronda, grisly and gronda he groaned on grena. As wounded as he was, so unreadily he ras, and followed fast on his trace with a sword the cane. Keenly that cruel kevered on heat, and with a cast of the carhond in cantle his strikes, and wines at Sir Wawen, that worthily wicht, but him limped the worse, and that may well leakes. He attelled with slang half slain him in slicht, the sword swapped of his swang, and on the mile sleekes, and Gawain be the colour kepest the knight. Then his leman on loft skrilles and strikes, ho greates at Gainur, on Gainur with grong and grilla. Laddie Maklis of Micht, have mercy on yondred knicht, that is so delful dicht, if hit Bethy wilde. Okay, what has happened? So there's continued fighting. Gawain gets the upper hand. He has Galaran pinned to the ground, but then Galaran strikes up, and he rises with his sword, and then he stabs Sir Gawain so badly that he's like just an inch away from dying, basically, and then Gawain stabs him up from below. It's sort of a reverse of what just happened. And at this point, then his leman, his lover, I think this is left man, left being love, and then man being person. His lover, his lady, on loft skrillis and skrikis. She screamed and shrieked, and she wept in front of Gainur with a groaning grill. So she's going up to Gainur, and she says, "Lady, have mercy on that knight, if it be your will." So like she's asking her basically to intervene. She's like, "You're the queen. You get my pain here as someone watching her her lover fight." It's not exactly what Guinevere is experiencing right now, but she can empathize perhaps. She's saying, "Hey, Gainur, can you intervene and make something happen, please?" Let's see what Gainur says. Fan willfully dam Gainur to the king went. He kocht of her coronal and knelled him till. Afterwards royal riches of rent, and the weaver wedded at the own will. Thesbornes in the battle so blade on the bend. They unwary with, unwounded full ill. For her shene sheldes, her shoulders are shent. The groanes of Sir Gawain does me heart grilla. The groanes of Sir Gawain graven me Sara, wouldest thou leve, Lord? Maketh his knightes accord. It were a great comfort for all that her were. So, Wenor says, sure, or she doesn't say sure, but she basically obliges. She goes to Arthur and says, you're the royal king, you have the power to stop this, please do it. There, you could see these knights are battle weary and all, I'm not going to describe how they look, they're all bestabbed by each other, not in a good shape. Sir Gawain's groans are hurting her heart. So she's like, make these knights accord. Make them come to an agreement, please. We're all kind of... We were excited to see the fight before, but it's kind of gotten out of hand, and we kind of just want it to end. Everyone will be happier. So, then spake Sir Galeron to Gawain the god. Even there never way in this world had been half so wicht. Harry maketh their lace ranke be the road, and before these real resing they me richt, and sithen maketh monraden with a mild mode, as man of medlert makeles of micht. He talketh toward the king, and he there he stode, and bade that Burley his bronda that Bernstead was plicht. Of rentes and riches I make imaka the relays. Dona knelled the knecht, and carpet was unhicked, the king stode upricht and commanded pace. So, upon hearing this plea from Gainor to Arthur, Galeron takes it upon himself to say to Gawain, you know, I never seen a knight so great as you. You're holding up pretty well, and you know what? I relinquish my claim. I release the land to you by the cross. Be the road means by the cross. The road is the cross. So, by the cross, you can have it. I'm tired of fighting, and you're fighting very well, so I have respect now for you. So, I give up my entire quest, the entire reason I came here? Okay. And then he says to the king, I'm making the release, and then he kneels, knelled the knecht, and carpet was, he sort of gives obeisance to Arthur. And then Arthur stands and commands peace. Commanded pace. The king commanded pace and cried on hecht, and Gawain was godly and laughed for his sake. Then Lord is to list that they lopen full licht, Sir Ewain fits Urjain, and Arak fits Lake, Maraka and Moilad, that most were of micht. Both of this travailed men, they truly uptake, unneth micht, thus storne stonde upricht. What for buffetes and blood her blaze wax black. Her blaze were brosed for baiting of bronze with altered morletting, dicht was her sachtling. Before the comely king, they held up her hondas. So, these other knights come up, and they just sort of pick up Gawain and Galeron, who are at this point just completely unable to stand, basically, all bruised and battered. So these other two knights, or the other four knights, I guess, Ewain, Arak, Marak, and Moilad, they help them off the battlefield and bring them to the king, and they hold up their hands, and King Arthur says, Her I give Sir Gawain with Gerson and Golda all the Glamorgan Londa, with Gravis so grena, the worship of Wallace at will on that Walda, with Crifones Castellus Cornelid full clana, Eke Ulster Hala to halve on to Holda, Wyford and Waterford, Walla de Iwena. Twa baron race in Bretagne with Borges so bold that arm bataille the bocht on bigot full brena. I shall do the aduke and duba the with Honda, with thee so sachtil with the knecht, that is so hardly unwicht, and relays him his richt, and grant to him his land. So, what does King Arthur, not Sir Arthur, King Arthur say? King Arthur says, Gawain, I'm going to give you even more land than you already have. He gives him some land in like southern Wales, some parts of England, and some places in Brittany, because as we learned way before, Arthur had claimed some land in France even, and Gawain had been to Tuscany. So they've got mainland Europe under their grasp too at this point. So Arthur just gives him more land. Good job, you get even more land than you already have. Cool. And what does he give to Galeron? Here he gives Sir Galeron Gawain. So Gawain's giving things to Galeron now. Without an anigela alphalondas antalides fro lower to lyra conica and carolel Cunningham on Kila. Yet he of chivalry challenge ham for ira, the Lother, the Lemok, the Loinak, the Lila, with fredes and foresters and fosses so fire. With the under a lordship so lenge her awi ahuila, unto their own the tabla macathira pyra, ishar refef the infelde in forest so fire. Both the king and the queen and all the docti bedena, forth the greve so grena to kerla the kyra. Okay, so Gawain says to Galeron, now that he has all this land, and he already had the land they were in, basically, the sort of region of northern England border with what is now Scotland, and he gives to Galeron a bunch of land. Now, apart from Carlisle, which this seems to be Carlisle, people cannot 100% identify what these other places are. Lower and Lower, Cunningham, Cunningham, maybe. But a lot of these places are still sort of like, scholars aren't sure what specific places are being referred to here. But it seems like what is happening is that Gawain is sort of bringing Sir Galeron into the fold of the Round Table. He says, come to the Round Table and make repair. And he also talks about sort of the forest and the fosses. And it seems like the land that he's giving him is sort of where they are, is sort of the border marches between Scotland and England. So he's sort of making him be the lord of that area, and a member of the Round Table. So then all the crew goes back to Carlisle from where they're having this battle. So we've picked up another knight for the Round Table. Was sort of the net gain here. The king to Carlisle is coming with knechtes och kene and other on the table on real arai. The ways that were in wanted so wathely iwena, sorgenes sonesaned sothly to sigh. Both the comfortest the knechtes and king and the queen, they were dubbed duques both on a die. They were wedded his weaver ulonkest iwena, with giftes and garsons a Galeron to guy. Thus that hadlen he withholdest at hende, when he was sanned sonde, they madig Sir Galeron that sonde a knechte the table rande, to his lives ende. Table ronde. To his lives ende. Why not guarded Weasley Rita into the west, to alter religious to reda and to sing, prestes with procession to pray were pressed, with 1,000,000 of masses, to mark the meaning, bucklered men, bishops the best, Thorfat Bretagne, belles de burde guarded ringe. This fairly befell in Inglewood forest. Under a holtes so hard at a hunting, such a hunting in holtes is not to be heeded. Thus the forest they fora, the terne knycktes in stora, in the tima arthure, this awntyr betide. Okay, that is the end of the awntyrs of Arthur at the Terne wathelyne. So, what happened at this very end section? So, they went back to Carlisle and got their Round Table all set up, and Galeron gets knighted, and they have a big feast. Everyone's all arrayed and decked out again. And then, lest we forget, Gainur goes a bit westward and has all the priests start a bunch of masses, because we don't want to forget. Her mom's spirit needs these masses in order to go to heaven. And then we sort of get like a meta closing of the story. All this marvelous stuff happened in the Inglewood forest, in a forest during a hunt, and there was none other so spectacular in the time of Arthur. So interesting. It's really funny to me, at least, that we kind of get these two sort of disconnected stories. it's sort of like there's two halves of the story. The first half is about Gainor and Gawain and the ghost during the hunt. And then in the second half, we get the sort of dispute about Galaran's land and Gawain and the fight. And they both close out here that we just read. Galaran becomes a knight, and when Gainor does the masses. And it's just sort of tacked on at the end that she does the masses. Like, oh, like, by the way, don't forget about the masses that we talked about. The only other thread that I can see connecting these two, other than Gawain being important in both parts of the story, is that it is Gainor herself who is the one who sort of is the catalyst for ending the fight in the second half. Maybe when she's asked by Sir Galaran's lady, like, hey, can you stop this fight? She doesn't argue. She's like, okay, this is the gracious thing for me to do. We don't really get any kind of internal monologue, though. It just says she willfully goes. Immediately, we don't really get any transition between her being asked and her asking Arthur. But at least to me, it seems like there might be a connection there with her, you know, being a gracious queen, as her mother sort of warned her to be. So she's sort of putting that into action. Now, immediately after seeing her mother warning her, like, be a good queen, be gracious to your subjects, all this stuff, we're then presented with a situation where she gets the opportunity to do that by intervening in this fight. I'm not sure if that's what whoever this poet was going for, because it's not very clear at all, but I could potentially see that connection between the two halves, because otherwise they seem pretty disconnected in terms of, like, what is happening and what's emphasized. It really seems like in the first half, Gainor is the more sort of main character, and in the second half, Gawain is a lot more like the main character. Or like the focus shifted more to him than it is in the first half, and vice versa. That is the story. We did see there were quite a few similarities and parallels with the Three Dead Kings in terms of, like, the warning and being gracious and that sort of thing. And also just the setting of, like, during a hunt, it suddenly gets dark under the trees, there's mist, and ghosts show up. But other than that, part of the reason I wanted to read this now is because it at least somewhat introduces us to the character of Gawain, who is definitely different in different stories. All of the Arthurian characters have slight differences, because every author, many of whom are anonymous, have different sort of ways or, like, takes on the characters. But Gawain, at least in this story and some of the other stories that we're going to read, is like a good, brave, courageous knight. There are others where he's like a villain, but in this one he's pretty good. We'll see similar things with Gainor/Guinevere. She has a range of sort of characterizations in the different stories, and this one she's pretty pious, pretty pious in terms of, like, how much she cares about her mother's soul, and that she follows her warning, and then she follows up on the whole, like, you need to do masses for me thing. But there is that sort of hint of, like, don't do adultery, Guinevere, that her mother tells her, that might suggest that this author's keeping those stories in the back of his head. So maybe in the mind of this author, later down the road, Gainor is going to have an affair like she often does in other stories with Lancelot. We didn't really see Lancelot in this story. In a lot of early Arthurian poems, Lancelot isn't even a character. It seems like either Chrétien de Troyes or someone in that sort of cultural milieu might have invented Lancelot, because it's really after that we see lots of Lancelot stories here. But the fact that the adultery bit was sort of emphasized, or, like, chastity was emphasized a couple times to Guinevere, to me makes it seem like maybe that's on the mind of the poet. Again, I can't know for sure, but I've seen other people suggest that too with regards to this poem. So thanks to Thomas Hahn for the edition that we read. There's paleographic work that goes behind making this a readable document, as opposed to the manuscript that would be kind of difficult to read, and I also just couldn't find it. I love to read from the manuscript. If you've been watching yesterlore for a while, you know that I like to read from manuscripts. But sometimes it's just too, like, the handwriting is too difficult, or it's just not easily accessible online. I like to find versions that are accessible that I can share the links with so people can read along. But this website has been very helpful, and it will continue to be helpful with other things we're going to read. And with that, I'm going to segue into plans for yesterlore moving forward. So, if we go to this sheet, which I think I've shared before, I'm going to have to adjust the cropping of this a bit, since this is a different page, different document, different thing going on. You can see past yesterlore schedule this far. There we go. I'm going to move that over. Cool. So, those of you who've been here for a while might remember we started with Old English riddles. We read more Old English riddles. We read Yareva and RSP. We read some letters in Old English. Then we read an ancient Egyptian stela. We read some ancient Greek riddles. We read some Swedish rune stones. And then we got into rune poetry. We read the Old English rune poem. We did a sort of excerpt from the Gothic Bible. We read the Norwegian rune poem. Then we did an excerpt from Havamal. We read Runatal from the Havamal. Then we read the Old Icelandic rune poem, and then we did rune poem comparison between the 3 rune poems that we had read. And that was sort of our rune poetry segment that lasted for a lot of the year. And then we moved into reading what we're currently reading, which is sort of more medieval stuff, Middle English fairy tales. Fairy stories, because I love that genre. It's a very different genre than rune poetry, of course, but I really do enjoy this genre a lot too. And I think it's yester in its lore, so it's yesterlore, and that's why we're doing it. So we read Sir Orfeo, and then we read Three Dead Kings. I did a little interlude with the introducing the Northumbrian rune poem, which I will remind you is still going on Saturdays. So tomorrow will be the next one. Will be from noon to 2 p.m. Pacific, and you can see what that means for your time zone if you go to the schedule on Twitch. You can see when that's going to be. We've been continuing that adaptation of North Sea poets' Northumbrian rune poems into Old English alliterative verse. And then we started the awntyrs of Arthure that we just finished. So let's look ahead now at what I originally had planned, and I'm going to talk about changing it and why I'm going to change it. So there's a couple things. One is I think the biggest priority for me is I really want us to read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. It's one of my favorite stories. It is yester in its lore. It's a very well-known story. I mean, it just got adapted into a pretty big feature film by A24 recently. So I think it would be fun to read the original for a lot of people, because it is a pretty popular poem, but not a lot of people read it in the original, which is understandable. It's in a difficult dialect, like a West Midlands dialect of Middle English, but it's also fun, and it's alliterative and it rhymes at the same time, kind of like this one, but it's sort of more consistently like alliterative verse revival, sort of in the Old English style of alliterative verse, but it also rhymes, so it's pretty intricate poetically. And the story is very fascinating. Now, part of my idea, though, with this sort of setup is these poems that I have here sort of build on each other. So this one, L'Enval, this is by Marie de France. Trying to pronounce her name more in an old French way than a modern French way. It's a story about a knight named L'Enval, and it is in Old French. And I thought it would be fun to read something in Old French, because we haven't really done anything in Romance languages yet. We've mostly done Germanic languages with a little bit of Egyptian and ancient Greek thrown in. Everything else has been in a Germanic language, so it would just be a cool change of pace to read something in Old French. But it is long-ish. Then there is Sir L'Enfant, which is a Middle English poem that is not directly based on L'Enval, but based on another poem about the same knight that seems to be an adaptation of the French one that is missing. So there's sort of like an in-between between L'Enval and Sir L'Enfant that is missing. And then there are more that come after Sir L'Enfant. but it would be cool to see like the both versions of the story because it's altered a bit. The overall story is very similar, but it's altered a bit in terms of some specifics that get kept in and kept out. And I wanted to read that because it has a lot of thematic similarities with the wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell, which I also wanted to read just to give us a better insight into Sir Gawain, and also because it has some interesting parallels and non-parallels with what we see in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. What Sir Launfal and the Lanval story have in common are that they are an example of a trope in Breton lays that comes up, which is sort of like entering into a relationship with a fairy woman where there are certain like stipulations you have to follow in order to be with her. There's like rules you have to follow, and if you break them, it's bad, and if you follow them, you're righteous and stuff. So it introduces that sort of motif, and I find that very interesting, because then with the wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell, we get what seems to be sort of a parody of a similar trope, which is the loathly lady story, which we see in a lot of different medieval poems. The most famous version of this story is actually not the wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell, but the Wife of Bath's tale that you can find in the Canterbury Tales. But the wedding of Sir Gawain and Dame Ragnell, that version of the story is, to me, more interesting because it is it seems to be a parody, and I also really like how Sir Gawain is portrayed in that one, and the specific stipulations of their relationship in the story are really interesting when thought about in sort of concert with what happens in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. However, all of that is very long. Like, all of these together will take some time to get through, and I really want to start Sir Gawain and the Green Knight very soon because it is long, and it is also sort of wintertime seasonal in terms of its subject, or at least time that it's set in. And so I think it would be to me it's a Yuletide tale, even though it's not super related to any sort of winter festivities in terms of its plot, it just happens to be set during that time. But to me, I always like to reread or revisit it around this time of year. So I really want to prioritize reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and I think it would be fun to start that as soon as possible. So I think we might just do it backwards. And when I say backwards, I just mean not entirely backwards, but just let's do Sir Gawain and the Green Knight before the others. Introduce Gawain in this story, learn what's going on here and like sort of the weird stuff about it, and then see how Sir Gawain sort of acts in this story. But maybe after we find sort of like the lead up to that trope in these two stories. And it would still be fun to read the Old French one and the Middle English one, I think. Of Arthur and of Merlin is another long story, and it's an Arthurian story, but it is subject-wise and sort of thematically very different, so we can save that one for later for sure. However, one other thing that I have said in the past is I would like to intersperse other stuff between these poems. I love this medieval fantasy literature, but or like fairy literature, I mean not fantasy, but it would be fun to sort of alternate with other stuff, kind of like we used to be doing with when we were doing the rune poems, and when we were doing the riddles and stuff, we would intersperse it with other things, like we read some Egyptian stuff and some ancient Greek stuff and some rune stones, and in between the rune poems we did other things besides the rune poems. And I would like to sort of continue that tradition and do something different next week. However, I'm not sure what that should be. Because there are a lot of different possibilities for what we can do next week before we start Sir Gawain and the Green Knight during our first December session. So I'm thinking something like these other earlier interludes, like maybe something else in ancient Egyptian, or maybe something else in ancient Greek, or maybe something in Latin, or something else. And I'm very open to suggestions. So if you want to, in the comments on this video, give a suggestion for some old, like very old literature you would like to read. Maybe if there's some other thing in ancient Egyptian you'd like to read together, I'm down. Just tell me what you want to read. I love to do that. Or some short ancient Greek texts. I've seen some interest in the comments before in like something in Sanskrit, and I've gotten some suggestions about that. I just not sure what to read that's short enough to fit into one session of yesterlore. So if you have suggestions for like short things we could read, I am very open to those. So with that being said, this is sort of my rough idea. So we're going to do some kind of interlude next time of non-Arthurian or Middle English literature variety. And then we will start Sir Gawain and the Green Knight the following week. So that will be December 2nd. Is when we'll start Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and that will probably last many a session because it is a long poem. But it is a fun poem. So that is what I had to say about my scheduling for yesterlore. Another reminder, on Saturdays I've been doing project streams. We've been adapting Northumbrian poems into Old English literature verse. So if you're interested in that, check that out. And then once we're done with that, we're going to return to some other projects I've been doing on Saturdays. I was sort of writing an alliterative verse version of the Ainu Lindale from the Silmarillion, adapting a sort of prose translation that I did when I was in high school. So that is another project that I want to continue with. And I might start some other project streams as well at different times. Those will end up in my schedule if I remember. But anyways, we will end this session of yesterlore today now, because we finished the awntyrs of Arthur. We will do nondescript, non-Middle English poetry thing next week. Might come as a surprise, but definitely if you want to influence that, please leave comments in the description. At least during the week that between when this goes up and the following week. But if it is past that time, if you're watching this way in the future, still leave suggestions, because I still read the comments and I will still take those into consideration, because I always like getting suggestions for other things to read in yesterlore. So with that being said, thank you everyone who was able to be here tonight, and thank you anyone watching this in the future. Please do the YouTube-y things if you're watching this on YouTube. Like, comment, subscribe, all that kind of stuff. Share it with people if you think they might be interested in reading this old stuff in the original language. And thank you. Have a great rest of whatever time zone you're in, and farewell.